Mansuk, he's supposed to be here. Hasn't left yet.
Okay.
He's coming. So this is a special treat for me to introduce to you a longtime colleague and friend, Brad Roberts. Could you shut that door, please? Who is director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Brad spent a lot of time in the Bay Area. He's a Stanford grad.
Don't want to get beaten up.
And then went to the London School of Economics and did a PhD at Erasmus University in the Netherlands. So he goes to some nice parts of the world. And he worked at the Congressional Research Service and then the Institute for Defense Analysis, and then Center for Strategic and International Studies. He was the editor of the Washington Quarterly. It's a major journal in this field. And then in 2009, he joined the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Weapons and Missile Defense. And was involved in the writing of major documents like the Obama Nuclear Posture Review and Missile Defense Review. And then, particularly in the latter half of the first Obama term, really was the administration's principal translator, architect, diplomat, to explain those documents and those policies and to persuade our allies that this was in their interests, which is not easy to do. This is throughout NATO Europe, and Japan, and South Korea, and Australia, and elsewhere. And he left at the end of the first Obama administration and had a nice stint at a big defense ministry think tank in Tokyo, and then went back to Stanford, to CSAC, the Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he wrote the book that you're assigned to read, The Case for Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. And we've just gotten great reviews, and it's very highly thought of. And as he was finishing up at Stanford, he was selected for this position that he heads now. The CGSR, you might want to say a few words about it, is a very, very active and rich, intellectually rich place, looking at a variety of contemporary policy and technical issues, many but not all related to nuclear weapons. So please welcome Brad Roberts. We will speak about extended deterrence and related issues. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thank you, Carl, for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to all of you for putting up with the book. I hope it was or is interesting to you. One reviewer said it's the book of lists, since there are so many places I go, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. But when it came out, it was sort of the only contemporary book on nuclear policy. Now there are more, a sorry sign of the times, as you all know, because you're enrolled in this course. I thought what I'd do is give you a little bit of historical context on extended deterrence, then talk about some emerging challenges to extended deterrence, and then take the conversation in any direction you would like to take it. So extended deterrence was actually the starting point of nuclear history. Nuclear deterrence is practiced by the United States. In other words, our first use of nuclear weapons, our first political use of nuclear weapons, our first effort to use our nuclear deterrent to some particular purpose was in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when at that moment the Cold War took shape. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, and we had a serious fear of major war in Europe. and nuclear weapons were thrown into the lurch. And it was only really a decade later when we stood back and paused and looked at the array of air bases with nuclear-equipped bombers that had been put in place that we began to worry about the stability of central deterrence because these bomber bases were vulnerable. There was famously an article written in 1958 or 59 called the Delicate Balance of Nuclear Terror. And what made it delicate was its vulnerability to the other side striking first. They had a big incentive to strike first if you thought war was inevitable. So then we got into 2-3 decades of primary thinking focus on central deterrence, the relationship between the nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union. And extended deterrence kind of receded into the background of our nuclear strategy thought. And then the Cold War ended, and our thinking about extended deterrence went away. The Cold War ended as a part of the ending process. President George H.W. Bush undertook some, quote, presidential nuclear initiatives, which were then reciprocated by President Gorbachev. And then there was an additional round between Clinton and Yeltsin. And these were unilateral but reciprocally understood steps to move away from the Cold War nuclear standoff. And for the United States part, it withdrew all of its nuclear weapons from East Asia, all of its nuclear weapons from naval surface vessels, leaving them on submarines, but leaving them on submarines only in ballistic missile submarines, not in cruise missiles. And from Europe, over that decade, it withdrew 97% of the nuclear weapons that had been in Europe in 1990. I mean, from the perspective of many of our allies, we closed the nuclear umbrella. That's the shorthand for the nuclear protection we had provided to allies. One indicator of this was the nuclear posture review. So nuclear posture reviews, have you talked at all about posture reviews and the policy process?
No, not too much. We're actually going to have Cheryl come in and talk about some of that.
Well, so we'll back up one step. Through the Cold War, well, in the American constitutional system, as you may understand, the president proposes a budget, but the Congress disposes the budget. The Congress actually decides where money gets spent and how. And the Reagan administration came in. The Reagan administration came in with a proposal for a giant defense buildup, and the Congress said, "How do we know which of this to say yes to, what to say no to? What's your strategy?" No administration had been obliged to provide a strategy to the Congress. So the Congress passed a requirement that says every new presidential administration must write an unclassified national security strategy. And this was very helpful to the Congress and to the nation. We were able to debate whether what the Reagan administration was doing made sense or not. And subsequently, every administration has had to, in its first year, get its thinking together about its national security strategy. So when the Cold War ended, the Congress thought, we got big questions about our defense strategy, not just our national security strategy, but defense strategy. And a long-time serving member of Congress, Les Aspin, went into the Department of Defense as the Secretary of Defense in 1992. And he said, I'm going to do a bottom-up review of defense strategy, often misremembered as the bottoms-up review, not a drinking game. So a bottom-up review, and the Congress then decided, oh, we like these defense strategy reports. So they legislated that every 4 years there would be a review by the Department of Defense of defense strategy. Those were called quadrennial defense reviews until last year. Now they're called national no, now they're called NDS, National Defense Strategy Reviews. And so the Congress then thought, well, it would be a good idea to oblige them to write us a report on nuclear strategy. So the first nuclear posture review, which was a response to a congressional requirement, was done in 1994, Clinton administration. And the basic idea of that nuclear posture review was lead, but hedge. Lead in moving away from the Cold War, lead in building, destroying these excess capabilities that might have made sense in the 70s and 80s, but not in the 1990s. But hedge against the very real possibility that we might wake up tomorrow and there would have been another coup, but this time not a failed coup in Moscow. And that the people in charge wouldn't be those nice, friendly, old, aged communists from the 1980s, but these would be really difficult people. That nuclear posture review mentioned the words extended deterrence twice. Once in the declaratory sentence that said the United States extends deterrence on behalf of our allies, and the second time it said remains committed to extended deterrence. Not a lot of thinking about extended deterrence. The 2001 nuclear posture review done by the George W. Bush administration said that our nuclear strategy should be attached to our defense strategy. The George W. Bush administration's defense strategy had four main goals: assure, dissuade, deter, defeat. Assure our allies they're going to be safe in a dangerous world. Dissuade potential competitors like China. And deter if you have to defeat enemies. Assure, dissuade, deter, defeat. And they tried to attach this to nuclear policy. So one of the objectives of nuclear policy is to assure our allies. And remember, the view of the George W. Bush administration was a good deal darker than the view of the Clinton administration, for some good reasons and for some not so good reasons. So assuring our allies that they would be protected was an important priority, and missile defense came into this discussion, and so did nuclear deterrence. But the George W. Bush administration was more focused on rogue states than on allies, and didn't go very far. When we came into our, I like to say I was doing penance for my sins in the 4 years I was in the Pentagon. My sins must have been karmic multiple lifetimes because there was plenty of penance to be paid. But we discovered allies in Northeast Asia who were very anxious about the credibility of the U.S. nuclear commitment to them. And this was because of North Korea's resumed progress towards building nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. And they were particularly fearful of what they had discovered an old Cold War term. And the way this first became clear to me was in a meeting with a Japanese delegation in my office where they were all speaking in Japanese until they got to the word decoupling. And there I heard this English word in the middle of this Japanese sentence. And it really brought home the point that they were focused on a Cold War problem, which was our allies in Europe fearing that once the Soviets had made the American homeland vulnerable to nuclear attack, we couldn't be counted on to defend allies in Europe, because we wouldn't dare trade Chicago to save Berlin. We would be decoupled from their defense because of our nuclear vulnerability. Well, the Japanese and the South Koreans were all over this. And in Europe, we heard from the original members of NATO that it was time to go further in moving away from Cold War nuclear confrontation. There was a German foreign minister, Westerwelle, who gave a speech that nuclear weapons are Cold War relics, we want them out of Germany. The problem was that there were other members of NATO. The first time I went to a NATO high-level group meeting, which was my peer group in the NATO structure, in the coffee break, 3 young women from 3 Central European countries, from the delegations of their countries to NATO, came up to me and poking me in the chest saying, don't you dare let those soft West Europeans persuade you to take your nuclear weapons out of Europe. The Russians are nasty. We're not done with confrontation with Russia. And we're weak enough as an alliance as it already is. And we signed up to this alliance because of the nuclear guarantee, because of you Americans being central to our defense. Don't give in to the anti-nuclear sentiment. And this was perhaps best expressed by some phone calls that President Obama got 2 or 3 days, so President Obama gave his Prague speech, in which he set out the vision of the long-term view of a world without nuclear weapons and made a commitment to take practical steps towards that end, but also to ensure that deterrence would remain effective. 3 weeks later, Kim Jong-un sent his thank you card in the form of an underground nuclear explosion, which was, the message was intended to be, you may go anti-nuclear, but we're going nuclear. And then President Obama had phone calls over the next 2 days. 2 from Northeast Asian leaders and one European leader. And they said, I didn't hear the call, so I'm only conveying secondhand, but the calls were roughly, lovely speech in Prague, Mr. President, and if there's anything we can do to help with the disarmament side of your agenda, let us know, because that'll make a real difference in our neighborhood. But on the way to Prague, are you willing to give up what's left of the US nuclear umbrella? Because if so, it's going to present us with some difficult choices. So those calls came at the moment the White House was debating the guidance they were going to give us about the nuclear posture review we were beginning in 2009. And so whereas extended deterrence didn't really figure in the 1994 review, did figure in the 2001 review a little bit. In the 2009 review, there was a debate while the White House was deciding the guidance. What's the verb that goes with extended deterrence? Do we want to continue it? Sustain it? The president said, no, we're going to strengthen it. And you guys in the Pentagon are going to go figure out how to reduce the role of nuclear weapons and strengthen extended deterrence at the same time. That was a nice chart. So we set off on a strengthening campaign. The strengthening campaign involved the use of comprehensive means to adapt deterrence to a changing security environment. Now, this meant different things in a NATO context from the East Asian context. But generally it meant, so we inherited alliance relationships that were pretty frayed. A lot of allies didn't like the George W. Bush administration. And the beginning point of having a strong relationship with an ally is looking at the world in the same way. Do you look out in the world and see the same problems and risks and opportunities, or not? Well, we spent a lot of time rebuilding the political foundations of these relationships and talking about how the world looked, what the problems were, where did deterrence fit in, where did nuclear weapons fit in. Then we talked about having a balance of conventional forces sufficient to prevent our enemies from getting a fait accompli. North Korea can't retake the whole peninsula again, but it could grab Seoul and then try and sue for peace. We wanted to make that more difficult. Russia, Putin bragged about being able to have soldiers in 4 NATO capitals in 60 hours. Well, if we can make that look like 6 weeks instead, it might look like a quagmire. That's sort of a deterrence factor. So there was a political piece, a conventional piece. There were roles for missile defense, both homeland missile defense and regional missile defense. There was a role for improved non-nuclear strike capability. I mean, imagine that tomorrow we were to see Kim Jong-un mounting a nuclear weapon on top of a long-range missile somewhere in North Korea. Is it credible for us to threaten to attack that with a nuclear weapon first? No. But if we could attack it with a long-range missile without a nuclear weapon on it, would that threat be credible? Much more so. Do we have any of those weapons? No. The only long-range strike weapons we have, the only intermediate range, are all non-nuclear. And then we said in this comprehensive approach to strengthening regional deterrence architectures that nuclear weapons also played an important, but they were a complementary role to all of the rest of this. And that deterrence constituted all these tools, and deterrence is something we and our allies do together. It's not something that the US just extends to an ally. And our allies were eager to hear this because it gave them a role, still does, give them a role in providing for their own deterrence requirements and providing for their own defense. Frankly, though, the United States is ambivalent about having allies have too much capability for independence. Because sometimes allies do things that we don't want them to do to get us in trouble. And the final nuclear posture review to mention here briefly is the 2018, the Trump nuclear posture review, which along with the missile defense review attaches a real significance to extended deterrence. The most controversial ideas in the Trump nuclear posture review relate to the production of 2 supplemental low-yield nuclear capabilities. This is all about fixing an extended deterrence problem in Europe. And similarly, their arguments about regional missile defense are all about fixing a problem of extended deterrence. So, from an historical perspective, I just want you to take away the main message that extended deterrence has been this increasingly important problem for the U.S. defense community, for U.S. defense strategy, not just nuclear strategy. It's at the core of our relationship with allies in a changed security environment. But let me dig a little deeper and say, so it could be that our alliances were more important, but not extended deterrence. Why is extended deterrence so much at the center of the emerging discussion? Well, 2. One reason. So our allies, our alliances look to Russia, China, and North Korea, not the way they look to us. We build alliances in the Cold War in order to do the job of containment and defense in Europe and Asia. We tried to adapt them to new purposes in the 1990s, basically to create and perpetuate regions, as we used to say about Europe, whole and free. And to do this, to build a whole and free security, economic, and political architecture in Europe and Asia that would look attractive to Russia and China to participate in. And what leaders in Russia and China and North Korea see, best summarized in a speech from President Putin on the occasion when he announced the decision to annex Crimea in a speech to the Russian parliament in April of 2014, which you have the quotes from if you've read that chapter in the book. But he said, look, let's call America's strategy what it is. It's the strategy of encirclement and containment aimed at keeping Russia weak and denying it its proper place in the world. It uses arms control to keep us weak. He went on to say, like a spring too long compressed, at a certain point you have to snap back hard. And I started crying. And you can find similar arguments from President Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. Well, they've done more than just complain and wring their hands. Beginning in the 1990s, these three countries got seized with the question of what first the Chinese called, and then others came to call, the problem of deterring and defeating a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. And all of those words have an impact on what they've chosen to do. Deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. The first to get really seized with this was China. It watched the Persian Gulf War. The Iraqi military was roughly the technical sophistication and size of the People's Liberation Army. 4 days. That didn't look too appealing to the Chinese. And then came the Taiwan Missile Strait crisis a few years later, in which, if we remember anything about it, we remember that the United States dispatched a carrier battle group. What every Chinese who remembers it remembers is we dispatched 2 carrier battle groups. The second one they took as a signal of readiness to go to war, which is what it was. And so the Chinese political and military leadership said, in reaction to these 2 crises, so war with America is possible, and it would clean our clocks if war happened. And in the 1990s, they didn't have money, technology, infrastructure in the military to throw at this problem. What did they have? Lots of good people, lots of very bright people. And they came up with a way of thinking about how to deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. For Russians, the catalytic event was really the Kosovo War. Here was the United States bombing, well, here was NATO bombing a former ally of theirs, winning without putting a single boot on the ground. This scared them. And for North Korea, it came a little later. There had been a pattern of, with the nuclear and missile program, build, bargain, pause. The nuclear program was very clearly about gaining concessions. And in about 2005, the North Koreans broke their way in by cyber means into the South Korean Ministry of Defense, stole war plans, discovered that if there were war on the Korean Peninsula, there was a decent chance that the United States and ROK would choose to try to remove the regime in Pyongyang. No more build, bargain, pause. And it wasn't just build, it was you better have a theory of how to deter and defeat a conventionally superior nuclear-armed major power and its allies. Just having nuclear weapons wasn't good enough. You needed to have some idea about how you might face a confrontation with America and escape with your interests intact. And so they faced a common problem with these 3 countries. And so it's not unsurprising that they came to basically a common set of answers to this. How do you deter and defeat it, blah, blah, blah. To reduce it to its simplest, there are 4 ideas in their theory of victory. 1, if war with America looks inevitable, go first, go hard, see something you can hold on to, then sue for peace. And present us and our allies with an image of a terrible price to be paid if we try to reverse it. Conventional fait accompli. But if we choose to try to reverse it, well, step 2, try to separate allies from each other and from the United States. Best case illustration of this. Kim Jong-un, whenever he talks about employing a nuclear weapon, he says, my very first target will be Tokyo. And we tend to hear that, we Americans tend to hear that and think, well, that's because of the bad blood of history between Koreans and Japanese people. No, that's to miss the whole point. The defense of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, would be done by the South Korean military, the American military on the peninsula, and a whole lot of forces and hardware sitting at bases in Japan under the United Nations flag. And the dispatch of those forces from Japan to South Korea requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. And in 1950s, that was a no-brainer. There was no risk for Japan. And Kim Jong-un is trying to make it a brainer. He's trying to say, do you Japanese really want to die in the hundreds of thousands to defend a country that you don't like very much and isn't your ally? Why would you want to do that? That's what those threats are supposed to do. But let's say the United States and its allies are still in this, or maybe just the United States alone. What's the third main concept? Well, what the Pentagon buzzword is called anti-access area denial. But basically make it very expensive in terms of blood and treasure for the United States to project military power. Because we don't have conventional military dominance anywhere in the world anymore. Everybody remembers, those of you who are old enough, everybody remembers Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Well, all of those forces are gone. And if you've read the report of the National Defense Strategy Commission from last November, it says we are likely to lose the next war we fight because we've allowed our conventional military power to go to such a low end. But let's say we fight our way through anti-access area denial, and we're still coming, and we're threatening the regime. What's the fourth main concept? Well, remind America that the homeland is vulnerable. Do you Americans really want to pay this price? And there are all sorts of ways to do that. It doesn't have to be a direct kinetic attack on the United States. It could be cyber, could be a big counter space operation. It could be an electromagnetic pulse weapon somewhere important. And it could be a nuclear attack. So, and then if that still doesn't work, then you can take America down, at least in some significant measure, even if you're losing. Get revenge. So, I like the term theory of victory. These are collections of ideas, beliefs, and wishful thinking. These ideas rest in part on a belief about us as Americans, that we, and not just Americans, the democracies. The democracies are seen as weak, easily divided, full of people who are fearful, led by weak people. So smash them in the face and they'll go home. That's a dangerous reading of our political culture, it seems to me, but I think it's in this way of thinking. And if you want to see a quick illustration of how these bodies of ideas come together into a coherent strategy, let me recommend Jeffrey Lewis's recent book. It's a work of fiction called The 2020 Commission. It's a fictionalized report of a congressional commission that's reporting in the year 2020 on the nuclear war that happened in 2019 between the United States and North Korea and South Korea. And it's a quick read, but it exactly shows you what the strategy looks like in practice and why it would go so badly. So I think of this as a theory of victory in the spirit, but in two different ways, Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. Clausewitz, so he took a particular view of victory because he took a particular view of war. War, he said, is a continuation of politics by other means. So victory isn't just when you vanquish your enemy. Victory is when you bring your enemy to a culminating point, a culminating political point, where your enemy chooses to no longer run the costs and risks of continued war. That's exactly what this is. But I don't believe that any of these three leaders would really like to put their theories to the test. What they'd much rather is that they subdue us without fighting. Sun Tzu. That we simply acknowledge that they're in a superior position and that their interests are more compelling, their stake is more compelling, and that we'll back down. And then they can just And then we can begin to accommodate their preferences on the European and Asian security orders. Sun Tzu, Clausewitz. So it's the historical background, a little bit of an understanding of why extended deterrence is right in the core of the national security agenda today. Either we're going to find meaningful answers to these problems, or the world's going to look very different pretty soon. Now let me discuss some emerging challenges in this topic of extended deterrence. First, so these theories of victory, I like to call a red, in the wargaming terminology, a red theory of victory is the adversary's theory, blue, and green is the term that goes for allies. Where's our blue-green theory of victory? Anybody seen one lately? I assert that there's one in the book, but that's in part because I knew that a lot of allies and enemies would be reading the book. But in fact, the focus of American military innovation ever since 9/11 has been elsewhere. And it's only been in the last, since the invasion of Crimea that we began to turn to these questions. I made reference to the National Defense Strategy Commission. So earlier on, I mentioned the National Defense Strategy, the every 4-year update. Well, the Congress also created for itself a commission that reads the strategy updates and offers 6 months later a critique, an assessment. And you can read that. It's all unclassified online. And it says, among other things, people in the Pentagon really have no idea about the problem of escalation and how to manage it. And they have no concepts for fighting and winning this kind of war. Russia and China and North Korea have created many new problems for us that we're struggling to solve. We've created no new problems for them to solve. And it goes on to say we'll lose. So we have some inherited ideas that we think fit this problem, but the first real challenge in front of us is to come up with a blue or blue-green theory of victory in the spirit of both Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. The second emerging challenge goes to the topic I mentioned a couple of times, but it's the loss of our conventional advantage. That's always been the backup for us, the comfort zone, the hedge, that if this really gets, they would never really go there because we can overrun them conventionally. Well, do remember that overrunning Saddam's forces in Kuwait, it did take he had to give us 6 months grace period. He just sat and watched while we build up our forces. No future adversary is going to give us 6 months to build up. And as I said, they don't exist anymore. We've built a military to go fight and win counterinsurgency warfare. Well, at least fight. We haven't even won counterinsurgency warfare. So we have not maintained the conventional advantage, which was our ace in the hole in dealing with these challenges. Third, in all of our in the countries that are worried, that are anxious about deterrence, that are committed to strengthening deterrence, there are also debates about how far to go in strengthening deterrence without screwing up your political strategy. This is most evident today in South Korea. We've been working to strengthen and adapt the regional deterrence architecture to emerging North Korean capabilities for a decade or two now, but it's on pause. The strengthening and adapting process is on pause because there are 1,000 different views in Seoul about how well the current détente might work out, but there's a unity of view that you should at least give it a chance. How long do you give it a chance? You suspend efforts to strengthen and adapt deterrence for how long? How do you know when it's time to go back to strengthening and adapting? And would going back increase the odds of getting a deal with Kim Jong-un because he'd understand there's a price to be paid? Or would it decrease the odds because he'd conclude that we're just bent on confrontation? There's a very similar debate in NATO today. NATO's done all the easy things to do to strengthen deterrence of Russian aggression against a NATO member. There are now hard things to do, and there's no political consensus to do that. Why? Because some people say, well, they say, have you ever heard of the security dilemma? The stronger we get, the more insecure the Russians are going to get. So we got to break this cycle. Let's not match the military threat they pose to us with new military means of our own. Well, I don't know. So my point is, there was consensus to do these things for a while. Now there's dissensus, and that makes it difficult to go forward. And lastly, of course, of the emerging challenges, the fourth and most anxious for most Americans is the deepening crisis of credibility for the United States. We are telling allies facing existential nuclear threats, trust us. You don't need nuclear weapons of your own, trust us. Your vital interests will be at risk. Even if ours aren't, we're going to use a nuclear weapon on your behalf. Trust us. And it has been a very reasonable bet for these allies to make for a long time, for a lot of reasons we can go into. But it's obvious today is not a time when allies are comfortable with that threat, that bet. I spent a lot of time talking with allies in both Europe and Asia, and behind closed doors, the conversation was very blunt and very uncomfortable for an American who believes that extended deterrence and these alliance relationships have served the American interest and their interest, the interest of our allies, for a long time. People use words like in East Asia, the tundra that was, no, the permafrost that was frozen for 7 decades has now all melted and everything's in motion. Many allies saying, well, 1 Trump term, our alliance relationships will survive. 2 Trump terms, probably not. And the consequence we all fear from that is that these countries that have given up nuclear weapons as part of a bargain to have an extended deterrence relationship with us will conclude that they need nuclear weapons of their own. That would be a bad choice for the United States, for those allies to make in a number of ways. Because it's hard to imagine that an ally in Northeast Asia that makes that choice wouldn't have an impact on allies in Europe, and vice versa. And how is the already weakened nuclear non-proliferation regime going to survive that? So I keep telling South Korean colleagues, look, South Korean experts should be debating whether or not South Korea needs a nuclear deterrent of its own. But you have to understand, everything's connected to everything. And the choice of South Korea to go that route probably means the end of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and a much broader proliferation. I used to have a quote on my office wall in the Institute for Defense Analyses. 2006, a journalist interviewed the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament and said, does Iran want nuclear weapons? And he said, of course, look at the neighborhood we live in. Look at our relationship with the most powerful external actors. And we would love to be the second and last nuclear armed country in the Middle East. But he said that's not the real choice. Because if we go nuclear, the Saudis aren't far behind, on and on and on it goes. So the real choice is between moving towards having nuclear weapons and living in a nuclear armed jungle. We don't like that choice. So we're avoiding the choice. I think that's exactly what it's like for Seoul right now. So the alternative hypothesis is that allies who feel they've been abandoned by the United States don't go nuclear. And what's their real choice then? Appeasement. sucking it up with the local neighboring major power, and bye-bye America. You know, the American-led world order, either way, a bunch of nuclear-armed allies aren't going to be cozying up to the United States to do lots of things. No, they got there because they're disgruntled and they feel abandoned by the United States. Or allies who have not gone the nuclear route but have chosen to appease their neighboring power. Neither of these worlds are worlds in which Americans should want to live. So, my closing thought is just to say that perhaps some of you are readers of Foreign Affairs magazine, and maybe when you were considering this course, you saw the November-December edition of Foreign Affairs, which had a special section on "Do Nuclear Weapons Still Matter?" is the title. And I think there were 4 essays, something like that. And they all talked about nuclear stuff. And then there were a bunch of other essays on the end of the liberal rules-based international order. The nuclear essays didn't mention rules-based international order. The people writing about rules-based international order didn't mention nuclear weapons. And my point is, that's not the real world. That these two things are intimately connected. And if we have a breakdown of the international order, we're going to have a breakdown of the nuclear order. If we have a breakdown of the nuclear order, we're going to have a breakdown of the international order. And that makes it all the more urgent that we engage in ordering projects in the nuclear business. But that's not the U.S. policy approach at the time. So with that, let me hope I put enough on the table about extended deterrence. I'm happy also to talk about the policy process, experience in the Obama administration, the views of allies, or to tell stories about Dr. Nacht when he was in the Pentagon.
Okay, thank you very much, Brett. I think what Dr. Roberts has done is really place these nuclear issues in this broader context. It's not just a series of technical issues. It's not just about U.S. defense planning. It's not just about even the U.S.-Russia competition. It's about a lot of other things, about the relationships that the U.S. has built up over decades with its allies, which stretch from the whole Eurasian continent. And it doesn't mean that you have to be an expert on every one of these things, but you have to be aware of the impact of nuclear policy on this whole fabric of the international nuclear order. So, questions, comments?
I have a question that's been sent along from someone who's joined us virtually.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned, this is being web streamed to Michigan State and other allies of our NSSC network.
Do you extend deterrence to these allies?
I don't think we do.
No, okay. Poor allies.
Eric?
So let's see. How do the secret sale of nuclear weapons technology to Saudi Arabia affect Iran's position?
Well, not really my topic. Actually, it prompts a little bit of an aside, which is the book's been well reviewed, but criticized by some for not being a book also about all of the other many topics that there are in the nuclear business. And in fact, in my perspective, there's been almost nothing written about the nuclear deterrence topic as a problem of U.S. strategy in a long time. I think it's of course intimately connected to the future of proliferation and the effectiveness of non-proliferation measures, because these are not entirely separate activities. But I mean, in what the question reminds me of is the fact that in the policy world, you are very often presented with problems for which there is no good option. There are a series of bad choices, and you have to figure out which is the least bad one. And inevitably, there are different interests at stake in different choices. It seems to me there is no good choice to make about the future of nuclear energy in the Middle East. Because any more nuclear potential in the region just points to possible future proliferation pathways. And, you know, on the one hand, encouraging, or not encouraging, but responding to Saudi interest in this area is certainly going to increase the anxiety of Iranian leaders about that crowded neighborhood I mentioned. On the other hand, if you can lock the Saudis into a regime of transparency and openness about the system, I'd rather have that than have them outside that regime of transparency. Yeah.
A question. Actually, I have two.
Just speak up.
Yeah, I have two questions. First is, of course, it seems like the best way for a nation to maintain strategic interests all over the world is just through overall military power, wherever they can get it, just as like a continuation of the American Empire. Do you agree with that?
No, I think it's the worst way to extend power. Raw military power isn't very enduring. Political power is enduring. Soft power is much more enduring. It's our values, it's what we've stood for as a nation that's been the source of our strength.
Thanks. My second question is, what would you say to people who suggest that the U.S. should lead by example in denuclearizing, and that if they want countries like North Korea or Iran to stop pursuing nuclear interests, that the United States should also.
So I think we've run this experiment over and over again. And I know people disagree because we still have a lot of nuclear weapons. But so we worked for an administration that set out that tried to lead by example. We undertook a number of unilateral changes to U.S. nuclear policy and posture. And we expressed, we followed the president's commitment to work to create the conditions that would allow others to join with the United States in taking additional steps to reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons. Let's do a quick assessment. The first priority, of course, was Russia. And we conceived a kind of two-step dance. Do something that would ensure that the arms control regime wouldn't go away, because START was due to expire in our first year, early 2010. And then work towards deeper reductions that would be more transformative of the political relationship. What did the Russians say? They didn't even really want to take the first step. I mean, the prior arms control cap had been 1800. They went all the way to 1550. You know, not very far. And did they want to pursue? Did they want to follow us on nuclear transparency measures? No. Did they want to engage in confidence security building measures? No. To give you a flavor of that discussion, in one meeting I was in, I asked, so why are you not interested in more confidence security building measures? You Americans already have too much of both. Okay. Second, China. We wanted to create a situation in which the Chinese would feel that they could get to a place where they could say, well, we're not going to tell you how many nuclear weapons we have, and we're certainly not going to sign an arms control agreement. But we can tell you we have enough for the time being. And to get there, we figured would take some years, and would take coming to some mutual understanding of the requirements of strategic stability. What did the Chinese say? Thank you very much, go away. Third, we wanted to roll back North Korea and Iran. Where did we get? Fourth, we wanted to work with allies to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in extended deterrence. Where did we get? Fifth, we wanted to undertake a major effort to understand what technology would permit us to do in the way of verifying a world in which we had made substantial additional nuclear reductions. We put a lot of money into that. What did the review show? Technology doesn't exist. Sixth, we put a lot of effort into non-proliferation diplomacy. What did we get? The ban treaty, which is roughly speaking an FU to the non-proliferation regime. So leadership by example, I don't see it. I don't see that the world is receptive to these kinds of actions by the United States. And indeed, I think there's a hypothesis, I can't prove it, but I think it's worth discussing, that our efforts to unilaterally go further towards the disarmament goal actually produce the opposite result. And the data point here is the 1930s, where if you look at the impact, so this is a long answer to your question, sorry. I know there are others, I'll be quick here and ending on. The League of Nations had three main core principles. One was disarmament. The work of the League produced two main outcomes. One was the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, a treaty that renounced the use of force, which the people who came to be in charge in Berlin and Tokyo a couple of years later interpreted as a tool for keeping them weak. And then came the First World Disarmament Conference, 1931 and 32. The price of admission was to commit to reduce your defense spending that year, and the only result was that some countries agreed to do it the second year. The United States won. The newly installed military group in Tokyo saw this as a big opportunity, withdrew from the League, withdrew from the conference, doubled military spending that year, doubled it again the next year. They'd already been at the treaty level, the Washington Treaty for Naval Armaments, and they doubled their spending, doubled it again. The United States had not come to the treaty level, and when did it come to the treaty level? 1942, a decade later. The leaders in these countries took these behaviors as indicative of an unwillingness to defend our interests, and it made the challenge more likely. And I think we hear Putin and Xi Jinping say arms control is a tool of the West to keep us weak. I think we have some of these same things that work today.
Just a quick follow-up to that.
Speak up, please. Speak up.
Just a quick follow-up. If pursuing unilateral denuclearization of power doesn't work, and if continuing the American military empire also doesn't work, which I agree with, then what does?
Liberal international world order. Yeah.
Now that the U.S. and Russia are no longer constrained by the INF, what weapons do you think that Russia will develop, and how will they deploy it? In the political sense.
Right. Well, I don't think Russia's going to develop, I mean, it's already developed the weapons that were banned by the treaty. And let's be clear about Russia's arms control practices. Russia's a party to 6 major arms control agreements: CFE, INF, Open Skies, New START, and then the multilateral ones, BWC, CWC. And then there are the agreements and undertakings, the Helsinki documents, the Vienna Accord, the Budapest Memorandum. Of all of those, and the presidential nuclear initiatives, of all of those things, the only agreement that the United States does not have a concern about Russian compliance, the only one, is the New START Treaty. And let's also just acknowledge the fact, I mean, Putin has made it very clear that Russia has developed additional capabilities that are strategic systems but aren't counted under the New START Treaty. So they're not exactly cheating, but they're not in the spirit of the treaty. So what more might Russia develop now that it's out of the last, except New START, arms control agreement? I don't think there's much more for it to develop. I think the question is more on our side. What do we choose to do about all of these areas. You want to come back on that?
My only further question is, do you potentially see them using something like the RS-26 in a similar role to the SS-20 and driving a lot of discord in NATO?
Well, I think they've already driven discord in NATO. I think part of what's interesting about this particular treaty violation. So the treaty violation occurred in 2008. The tests of this missile, 2008. And then a decade passed before reports came of deployments. A decade. What was that? There's no other development program where the Russian military has developed and tested something and then not deployed it. Unless the testing program failed, which this test did not. What explains it? I think it was, okay, we violated the treaty. You know that we've violated the treaty. We know that you know that we violated the treaty. What are you going to do? And we, the Obama administration, did what you're supposed to do under treaty law. What you're supposed to do is if you have a complaint about another party's compliance, you approach that party and try and address it. I recall that you were a part of those meetings. I was a part of some of those meetings. Mm-hmm. The Russian reaction was, really? Go away. We have complaints about your compliance. Less polite than that.
They complained we were the initiator of violating that, not them.
Right. And so then we, having had 30 meetings at quite high levels, decided it was time to go public. Well, first we went public with our allies, who basically said, yeah, this is very troublesome, but you're the United States that screwed up all that intelligence on Iraqi WMD. We want to see the proof. And we had 2 or 3 allies in Europe who basically caused us to lose 2.5 to 3 years on this topic over replaying the Iraq issue. And then finally, sort of, the administration went public on this. My own personal feeling is the Obama administration should have said at the end of 8 years, it shouldn't have been silent. It should have said, we declare Russia to be in material breach of the treaty. We leave it to the next administration to decide what to do. But by virtue of not taking on this issue, we left it to the next administration, which, because it turns out to be President Trump, entirely politicizes the thing in a way it wouldn't have been politicized otherwise. So, long answer. Yes.
So given the current state of lack of trust with some of our allies and us, and well, the fact that Russia basically keeps letting us go away, do you see a political solution to bring back different arms control, or at least people at the table to start talking about these issues rather than slamming the door in his face?
Excuse me, their class project is to find a way to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and constitute the INF.
Good luck. Well, it would take convincing President Putin that that's the right outcome. He's a guy who believes that arms control deal is a part of keeping Russia weak. So is there a way to think about this? Well, what's the most optimistic scenario? That somehow, now that the collusion issue is behind us, the president has been vindicated, that he and Putin have a series of summits that, and they're able to say, peace through strength. Our people in both countries voted us in. We've done a lot of things to get stronger. Now we're delivering the peace part of the equation. And we're going to go down in history as the greatest deal makers that ever were. That's the pathway. Is it plausible? I don't think so. I don't see Mr. Putin getting there. I like almost everybody who's worked on nuclear arms control has favored a New START extension. I'm becoming less and less inclined in that direction. Because my feeling is it's only when the hope of extending the long-standing pathway, then what are people looking for? They're looking for the next step on the START pathway. Can we get to 1,000? That world's gone. And it will take, I think there would be a salutary shock to the intellectual community that would get it over worrying about how to perpetuate the old approaches and getting onto the next business of how do we start from scratch on a logic for arms control that fits the new strategic environment. And I don't think we can get there so long as our principal question is how do we perpetuate the old strategic logic.
By the way, if I can interject here, I think, because I don't think this was discussed in your status report of the project, I think you do need to address the impact and suitability of extending New START as a consideration in fixing the INF. You heard one point of view, there are multiple points of view. A New START expires in February 2021. So that's right after Trump is reinaugurated. Or
15 days.
so someone else is inaugurated. So that'll be on the agenda. The U.S. President in February, well, January 20th, 2021. You need to address that directly.
But you know, if you're arms control fans, how do you also say, oh, never mind, all that cheating, we'll just get on and make the next deal. I mean, if you believe in arms control, which is a contract between two or more parties, and one side energetically exploits the contract to their advantage, then you rush out and eagerly sign the next contract? How does that work? It's not practical politically. So
part of the dynamic of the INF, right now, Russia and China are on reasonably friendly terms, but with the cognizance that the future could be like the past, and that the dynamic could be very different. Russia, of course, fears the border. Could the INF issue become simpler if you include the third party? China's been resistant to it. But is there a simpler path to get back to the INF if it's required up front that all three parties sign on?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, we've been pressing China since the early 1990s. When was the first time the Russian foreign minister mentioned Russia's dissatisfaction was in the Clinton period? Who was Secretary of State at the time, after Vance?
Christopher.
After Christopher.
Mallon.
Oh, right. Went to Beijing. Thank you very much. We don't do arms control. A few years later.
Until we come down to their levels.
Right. Well, and then first it was until we cut them in half. And then they were cut in half. And oh no, the goalpost changed. Then Connie Rice went. There have been 3 secretaries of state who have gone to Beijing and said, we'd really like you to do this. And from a Chinese perspective, there's no reason to. There's no restraint that America is prepared to exercise that would be a sufficient compensation to the price China would pay. Because theater nuclear forces, and well, first of all, their military strategy depends first and foremost on missiles. And their strategy is, as I suggested, about breaking alliances and coercing allies, and you can't do that with ICBMs. And so what you're asking the Chinese to do is to sacrifice the core tenets of their national military strategy to serve somebody else's good. I just don't. It's not because they have a visceral opposition to arms control in this case. It's because we're asking them to do something that, by asking them, conveys to them the message that we don't really understand their security strategy and environment. Who's next?
Now I have a question, shifting back to Russia and NATO Europe. Russia has espoused this doctrine. It remains controversial, I guess, among American analysts, that they really adopted it of escalate to de-escalate. And there are now US and NATO forces closer to Russia than they've been in quite a while. What do you think the effect of that doctrine and those troop movements has had on the strength of extended deterrence? Is the United States viewed more credibly in Europe, or less so, or what's your take on that?
So there is a debate about escalate to de-escalate, which is a sort of, I have the impression often that people are debating, they think they're debating the same thing. I mean, it may not be the case that Russia's nuclear employment strategy is to employ nuclear weapons very early in a conflict, which is the way escalate to de-escalate is often interpreted. In fact, Russia will have military options to employ nuclear weapons early or late or not at all. And it'll be a political judgment, not a military one, about when and if they're employed. Do they have an escalate to de-escalate strategy? Of course, that is their whole military strategy, and not just nuclear. They have to be able to persuade us that they are willing to run more costs and risks than we are. Because in their view, and their view is that's a credible threat for them to make, because there's an underlying asymmetry of stake where their stake is higher than ours, because any war in Europe involves their sovereignty and integrity and survival, whereas it involves reputation for the United States, but not integrity and survival. The pressure on the Western deterrence strategy coming from I'll make one other statement about the escalate to de-escalate thing, and that's that I don't really think Russian nuclear strategy has changed much in 30 years or 50 years. I think what's changed is Russian grand strategy, which is to say, nuclear modernization by Russia didn't trouble me at all in the 1990s and early 2000s, because there was no plausible pathway to conflict. And what Russia was really trying to do was redress the weakness that had emerged in its overall military posture, and the quickest way to do that was with nuclear weapons. But boy, I think that 2014 Putin speech is pivotal. It says, I'm snapping back hard against a European security order I cannot accept. And I'm willing to use all means to do that, including taking away the sovereignty of another country. So,
That they had guaranteed.
That they had guaranteed. So this makes Russian nuclear doctrine in more trouble, even if it hasn't changed. So, but what pressure does this put on Western deterrence strategy? So NATO's deterrence strategy is built on so NATO is an alliance. Every decade or so, the leaders come together and writing new strategic, we do the writing, but they agree to a strategic concept, roughly 100 paragraphs. And it sort of gives a view of the world and the alliance's place in it, and what some of the major challenges are and what they're doing. And the strategic concepts have always said NATO's deterrence posture will encompass an appropriate mix of nuclear and non-nuclear means at the lowest level consistent with the requirements of the then existing security environment. Appropriate mix. And the current strategic concept goes on to say, written in 2010, NATO is an alliance without enemies. Russia is a potential security partner. NATO is an alliance that maintains nuclear plans against no country, but maintains an ability to plan nuclear war. And the ultimate guarantee of the security of the allies is provided by the strategic deterrence of its 3 nuclear-armed members. But deterrence is further underwritten by the alliance's unique sharing arrangements. And all of that is under pressure. And the alliance in particular is struggling with the fact that, so it said in 2012, its last major review of its deterrence and defense posture, it said that the then existing mix was appropriate to the then existing security environment. And that mix included, well, approximately, well, what was the 3% that was left of the nuclear weapons, the US nuclear weapons that had been there in 1990, and the sharing arrangements. So this is an arrangement whereby 5 or 6 NATO allies have in their air forces aircraft that are certified to also deliver nuclear weapons in time of war. They would do so under the sole authority of the American president, and the weapons are stored in their territory. And this is a Cold War vestige from the 1960s. And
This is Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. About 200 weapons.
which are classified facts, but available widely on the internet.
I guess.
Yes, or so. And just to illustrate this landscape, Defense Minister Shoigu last week gave a speech, the Russian defense minister, in which he reported on the results of the second 5-year part of the military modernization program. And he said by the end of 1919, God, I keep saying that, by the end of 2019, we will in 10 years have increased the number of delivery platforms, meaning aircraft, ground-based systems, and ships, capable of striking the West by a factor of 30. And we've increased the number of cruise missiles capable of being carried by these platforms by a factor of 18. And those cruise missiles are all both capable of carrying a nuclear weapon or a non-nuclear weapon. NATO, so how does NATO say that nuclear force that was appropriate in a world that was pre-Crimea is still right? And it can't discuss these things. They're a taboo topic for many allies. And this is driving a huge wedge in the alliance. And it's analogous to making that one missile test and saying, okay, you know that I've cheated. You know that I've gained this advantage. I know that you know. What are you going to do about it? And the alliance is pulling apart over these things. And the Trump administration is putting the focus on 2%. And boy, I don't know what 2% does for this problem set. This isn't a money problem. This is what do you say, but it's a declaratory problem, and yes, in part about forces, but not primarily.
Okay, well, I think we've explored this complex subject in some considerable detail. I hope you found it useful, and I'd like you to please thank Dr. Roberts.
Thank you. A gold-plated
Small tactical media.
excellent. Very nice. Thanks.
Next time, Wednesday, Professor Van River will discuss weapons effects. And I'll be discussing a little bit more on deterrence, not to be totally not. I'll see you Wednesday. And we also need time for you to fill out a Goldman School card on your views about what's working in the course and what's not. We'll hand out index cards like this for you to fill out. Okay? See you Wednesday.
Good to see you quickly.
I hope you'll be able to handle